The sky over Constantinople was dark on that fateful night in 1071. The wind howled through the streets, carrying whispers of doom and despair. Inside the Grand Palace, the air was thick with tension. The Byzantine Empire, once a mighty stronghold of the Mediterranean, was on the brink of collapse. Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes, a man of military prowess, had just suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of the Seljuk Turks. The Battle of Manzikert, a name that would echo through history, had shattered the empire's defenses and left it vulnerable to invaders. Romanus lay in his bed, his mind racing. The images of the battlefield haunted him: Turkish arrows raining down, the cries of his soldiers, the relentless advance of the Seljuk army under their sultan, Alp Arslan. He had fought bravely, but it was not enough. Now the empire he had sworn to protect was slipping through his fingers. Meanwhile, in the southern reaches of the empire, the Fatimid Caliphate, a powerful Shia dynasty, was also facing its own challenges. The Caliph al-Mustansir, a young boy of 7 when he ascended the throne, was a mere figurehead. Real power was held by 3 rival groups: the Berbers, the Turks, and the Blacks. The capital, Cairo, was a city of intrigue and danger, where plots and counterplots were the order of the day. The Fatimids, who traced their lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad's daughter Fatima, had once ruled a vast empire stretching from North Africa to Syria. But by the 11th century, their power was waning. The empire was plagued by internal strife, famine, and disease. The caliph's treasury, once overflowing with wealth, was now a shadow of its former self. The once great library, with its thousands of volumes, had been looted and its contents scattered to the wind. In the buffer zone between the Byzantine Empire and the Fatimid Caliphate lay the lands of Syria and Palestine. This region, known for its strategic importance and religious significance, was a battleground for competing powers. The Byzantines had retaken the city of Antioch in 969, holding it until 1084. The Fatimids, meanwhile, had extended their control into Syria, capturing Jerusalem, a city sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. But the Fatimids were not the only ones vying for control. Arab tribal leaders, such as the Hamdanids and the Murtasids, had established their own principalities, each seeking to carve out a piece of the fractured landscape. The Hamdanids, a family of North Arabian origin, had ruled Aleppo until 1004, while the Murtasids took over from 1024 to 1080. The Jarahids, a nomadic group from the South Arabian tribe of Tayyi, had also made their mark, but their power was short-lived. The arrival of the Seljuk Turks in the region was a game-changer. These nomadic warriors, led by Atsiz, had been invited by the Fatimids to deal with the troublesome nomadic tribes in Palestine. But once they arrived, they did not leave. Atsiz established himself as the ruler of the territory and even captured Jerusalem. When the Fatimids tried to oust him, they failed. Atsiz then moved on to Damascus and even attempted to invade Egypt, but was ultimately assassinated by Tutus, the brother of the great Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah. The Seljuk Turks were not new to the Near East. For centuries, Turkish slaves, known as Mamluks, had been a crucial part of the region's military and political landscape. The Mamluk institution, a form of military slavery, had been established during the early days of Islam. Muslim generals would capture Turkish prisoners of war and train them as elite soldiers. These Mamluks, entirely loyal to their masters, became a vital component of the Muslim armies. The Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled from Baghdad, had especially favored Turkish Mamluks. Caliphs like Al-Mamun and Al-Mutasim recruited large numbers of Turkish soldiers, forming Turkish bodyguards and military households. These Mamluks eventually became powerful figures in their own right, supporting provincial governors and local rulers who had taken control of various parts of the empire. The Mamluks in Egypt, known as the Chelunids and the Ikhshidids, were particularly influential. Ahmed B. Chilun, the founder of the Chelunid dynasty, was the son of a Turkish slave sent from Bukhara. He rose to become the governor of Egypt, establishing a powerful and independent state. The Ikhshidids, another Mamluk dynasty, took over after the Chelunids, ruling Egypt until the Fatimids arrived in 969. The social and legal status of the Mamluks was complex. While they were initially slaves, Their conversion to Islam and eventual emancipation upon their master's death granted them the rights and status of free Muslims. By the time the Mamluks established their own sultanate in Egypt in 1250, the term Mamluk no longer referred to slaves, but to a powerful military elite. But the arrival of the free Turkish nomads, the Turkomans, brought a new wave of chaos. These tribesmen, led by the Seljuk clan, swept through the region, displacing the settled populations and challenging the established powers. The Seljuks, with their fierce warriors and nomadic lifestyle, were a force to be reckoned with. As the 11th century progressed, the political and military landscape of the Near East was being reshaped by these new powers. The Byzantines, the Fatimids, and the emerging Seljuk Turks were all vying for control, setting the stage for a period of turmoil and change. The world was on the brink of a new era, one that would see the rise of the Crusaders and the reshaping of the entire region. The First Crusade was a major event that changed the face of the Near East. It all began in 1095, when Pope Urban II called on Christians in the West to help their fellow believers in the East. The Pope's speech at the Council of Clermont sparked a massive movement. Thousands of people, from nobles to peasants, decided to join the crusade. The first group to set off was led by a man named Peter the Hermit. This was the People's Crusade, made up mostly of poor and untrained people. They reached Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, in the summer of 1096. However, they were not ready for the Seljuk Turks. The People's Crusade was quickly destroyed near the city of Iznik. Meanwhile, the main Crusader army, led by nobles like Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse, was preparing to cross into Asia Minor. They took the city of Iznik and defeated the Seljuk leader Kilik Arslan at Dorylium. This victory slowed down the Seljuk control in the region. The Crusaders continued their journey and reached Edessa, a city ruled by an Armenian named Toros. Baldwin of Bouillon, Godfrey's brother, took over Edessa and made it a Crusader county in March 1098. Next, the Crusaders moved to Antioch, a major city that stood at the gateway to the south. After a long siege, they captured Antioch in June 1098. Bohemond, who played a key role in the siege, claimed Antioch as his own principality. The Crusaders then marched south towards Jerusalem. They reached the city and, after a fierce battle, captured it on July 15, 1099. Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen as the ruler of Jerusalem, but he did not take the title of king. Instead, he called himself the Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. When Godfrey died a year later, his brother Baldwin became the first king of Jerusalem. At the same time, Raymond of Toulouse was trying to capture the city of Tripoli. It took him a long time, but he finally succeeded in 1109, 4 years after his death. The lands the Crusaders took over formed a long strip from north to south. The two main cities, Antioch and Jerusalem, were about 560 kilometers apart. The northernmost point was Edessa, about 250 kilometers from the sea. The central part was mostly along the coast, and the southern part expanded into the Judean highlands around Jerusalem and into Transjordan. The Crusaders took these lands from the Seljuk Turks, who had two main centers at Aleppo and Damascus. Edessa had been an Armenian territory, and Jerusalem and Ascalon were the last strongholds of the Fatimids in Palestine. Tripoli, once a Fatimid possession, had become independent under a family of Shi'i judges. Even though the Crusaders gained a lot of land, they did not control the main north-south route from Aleppo to Damascus. This meant that the Seljuk Turks could still move freely through the region. The fall of Edessa to Zangi in 1144, and the failure of the Second Crusade to capture Damascus in 1148, marked the end of the Crusaders' expansion eastward. Antioch and Jerusalem were the most important cities in the Crusader states. Antioch, with its long history dating back to the 3rd century BC, was a major urban center in the Roman Empire. It had been under Muslim rule since the 7th century, except for a period when the Byzantines held it. Jerusalem, on the other hand, was significant for its religious history. It was the capital of the Hebrew monarchy, the site of the temple, and the place where Jesus was crucified and resurrected. For Muslims, it was the third holiest city, where the Prophet Muhammad made his night journey and ascended to heaven. Edessa, captured by the Arabs in the 7th century, had been under Muslim rule until the Byzantines took it back in 1037. After the Battle of Manzikert, it came under Armenian rule. Tripoli, the last major Crusader city to be fully established, had been under Muslim rule since the 7th century. It was a prosperous port city, and the gateway to the hinterland of Hims and Damascus. The arrival of the Crusaders was a shock to the local people. Many fled from the massacres that followed the capture of cities like Antioch, Marat al-Numan, and Jerusalem. Some towns, like Arsuf and Tripoli, surrendered to the Crusaders, and their inhabitants were allowed to leave peacefully. The refugees mostly went to other Muslim cities in Syria, such as Damascus, Aleppo, and Hama. Surprisingly, they did not immediately call for a holy war jihad to avenge their losses. It wasn't until 1105 that a Muslim scholar named Ibn al-Salami started preaching about the need for a jihad in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. The First Crusade had a profound impact on the region. It changed the political landscape, created new states, and led to significant demographic shift. The Crusaders' presence would continue to shape the Near East for centuries to come. In the mid-12th century, a unique event of emigration took place in the Frankish territories of the Holy Land. This wasn't a typical movement of people. It was a hejra, a flight from infidel to Muslim territory, inspired by the Prophet Muhammad's own flight from Mecca to Medina. It all started in the Nablus district, where a Muslim scholar named Ahmad B. Qudama faced trouble with his Frankish lord, Baldwin of Ibelin. Baldwin accused Ibn Qudama of using his Friday sermons to withdraw agricultural labor, which led Ibn Qudama to decide that he and his followers should emigrate to avoid living under Frankish rule. The emigration began in 1156 and continued for about 20 years. Ibn Qudama and his followers moved to the Damascus suburb of al-Salihiyya, which became a center for promoting the jihad or holy war against the Franks. This was a significant event because it showed that some Muslims were willing to leave their homes to escape non-Muslim rule, even if it meant abandoning their land and community. Meanwhile, the towns that the Muslims left behind were taken over by the Franks, who settled there and built a new life. These Franks, known as Pulanes or Colts in Latin, were the descendants of the Crusaders who had been born in the Holy Land. They adopted many local customs and styles of dress, which made them different from the European Crusaders who visited. The Pulanes found a secure and comfortable life in the towns, where they lived alongside traders from Italian cities. In the countryside, the Frankish lords lived off the work of the local peasants, who were mostly Muslims and Christians. The peasants were already living on the land before the Franks arrived, and they continued to farm it under their new rulers. The Frankish lords, however, had a feudal system, which was different from the previous Muslim landowners. This meant that the lords were part of a network of power and loyalty, which affected how they managed their estates. The peasants' lives didn't change much under Frankish rule. They still paid taxes and gave gifts to their lords, just as they had under Muslim rule. The main difference was that the poll tax, which was previously only for Christians, was extended to Muslim peasants as well. The Franks were also interested in growing sugar, which was used in cooking and medicine. The peasants lived in organized communities and had their own local officials, the scribe and the reis. The scribe was like a steward who kept records and acted as a translator between the lord and the peasants. The reis was a respected leader in the village, with more freedom than the other peasants. For example, if a crime happened in the village, the reis could be responsible for catching the criminal or detaining a neighbor if the criminal couldn't be found. Overall, the Frankish rule in the countryside didn't bring many changes to the peasants' way of life. The towns, however, became centers of Frankish culture and life, with a mix of European and local influences. When the First Crusade began, it was a shock to the Muslims of the region. A chronicler named Ibn al-Qalanisi described the arrival of the Franks as a massive and terrifying event. He noted that the people were very anxious and afraid, especially after the Franks defeated a Muslim army at Dorylaeum. The loss of Muslim lives was particularly concerning to Ibn al-Qalanisi, more so than the capture of cities like Antioch or Jerusalem. Another writer, Ibn al-Salami, saw the Crusade as a result of Muslim disunity and lack of faith. He wrote a book called The Book of the Holy War in 1105, where he criticized Muslims for their internal conflicts and suggested that this was why the Franks were successful. He also saw the Crusade as part of a broader threat to Islam, including the loss of lands in Sicily and Spain. The Arabic chroniclers of the time didn't treat the Crusades as a separate category of events. Instead, they included stories about the Crusades and their broader histories, often as part of the local or regional chronicle. It wasn't until much later, in 1520, that a writer named Ahmed al-Hariri wrote a comprehensive account of the Crusades. One of the most important chroniclers, Ibn al-Athir, wrote a detailed history of the First Crusade in the 13th century. He described the Franks' capture of Antioch and their advance to Jerusalem, but he didn't mention the role of the Pope in starting the crusade. Instead, he presented it as a political move by two Christian leaders, Baldwin and Roger of Sicily. According to Ibn al-Athir, Roger cleverly suggested that Baldwin focus on Jerusalem instead of attacking North Africa, which would have disrupted Roger's own interests. The First Crusade also had a significant impact on the Byzantine Empire, which was ruled by Emperor Alexius I Comnenus. Alexius had asked the West for help against the Seljuk Turks, who had taken over much of Anatolia. The Pope Urban II responded to this request by calling for a crusade. However, the Byzantines and the Franks had a complicated relationship. The emperor had hoped for a small group of mercenaries to help him, but instead he got a large and sometimes unruly army of crusaders. The Crusaders' arrival created tension between the Byzantines and the Franks. The emperor was concerned about the Franks' ambitions and their potential to threaten his own power. Despite this, the Crusaders and the Byzantines worked together to some extent, especially during the siege of Antioch and the capture of Jerusalem. However, the relationship was often strained, and the Crusaders sometimes acted independently, which worried the emperor. The Byzantine Empire and the Armenians in Cilicia, northern Syria, and northern Mesopotamia were also affected by the crusade. The Armenians, who were Christians, sometimes found themselves caught between the Franks and the Muslims. Some Armenians welcomed the Franks as protectors against the Seljuk Turks, while others were wary of the Franks' intentions. In the end, the First Crusade changed the political and social landscape of the Near East, creating new tensions and alliances that would shape the region for centuries to come. The emperor had hoped for a small, manageable force of mercenaries from the west. Instead, a massive crowd of armed pilgrims, all set on reaching Jerusalem, showed up at his capital, Constantinople. This unexpected influx created huge problems for the Byzantine authorities. They had to deal with security, feeding, and housing thousands of people, which was a massive logistical challenge. Among the nobles leading these crusaders was Bohemond of Taranto, the son of Robert Guiscard. Robert was a Norman who had become a powerful figure in southern Italy. In 1059, Pope Nicholas II had made Robert the Duke of Apulia and Calabria, and even promised him Sicily, though it was his brother Roger who actually conquered the island from the Muslims. The Byzantine Empire still had some control in southern Italy, but in 1071, Robert captured Bari, the last Byzantine stronghold, effectively ending their presence in the region. Despite the conflict, there were attempts at peace. Emperor Romanus Diogenes proposed a marriage alliance, which Robert rejected. After the disastrous Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where the Byzantines suffered a significant defeat, Emperor Michael VII tried again. In 1074, Robert sent his daughter, renamed Helena, to be betrothed to the emperor's son. However, Michael was overthrown in 1078, and Robert then aimed to control Byzantine policy directly. He even supported a fake emperor and led an expedition to Dyrrhachium in 1081. Bohemond, who had been deprived of his inheritance when his father repudiated his mother, joined this expedition. They captured Dyrrhachium in 1082, but Robert returned to Italy, leaving Bohemond to continue the invasion. Bohemond was defeated by Emperor Alexius in 1083, and also returned to Italy. When Bohemond and other noble crusaders arrived in Constantinople in 1097, Emperor Alexius tried to secure his authority over them by making them swear an oath of fealty. This was met with varying levels of reluctance. Bohemond, eager to regain Alexius's favor, swore that he would not keep any former imperial possessions and would not allow others to do so. The Crusaders then crossed into Asia Minor, where they laid siege to Iznik, the capital of Sultan Kilik Arslan. The Sultan was away, but he returned and was defeated. The city surrendered to the emperor, not the Crusaders, much to their disappointment. The Crusaders were upset that the emperor had allowed Kilik Arslan's family and nobles to escape to Constantinople safely. This resentment grew as the Crusaders moved through Anatolia. Bohemond and his Norman-Italian contingent were guided by a Byzantine general named Taticius, who had a detachment of troops. They defeated Kilik Arslan's forces at Dorylaeum on July 1, 1097. They passed through important cities like Iconium, Heraclea, and Caesarea, but did not try to conquer them permanently or return them to the emperor. The siege of Antioch, which lasted from October 21, 1097, to June 3, 1098, was a major event. Taticius left the Crusader camp in February, and the emperor, believing the Crusaders were in trouble, did not send help. Bohemond, who had been in contact with a renegade named Furas, helped the Crusaders enter the city. When Antioch fell, Bohemond's flag was raised, and he claimed the city as his own. The emperor had no representative there to demand the city's return, so Bohemond's claim was accepted, and he became the first prince of Antioch. The relationship with the emperor remained tense. In July 1098, Hugh of Vermandois went to ask Alexius to come to Antioch, but the emperor did not respond until the spring of 1099. He sent envoys demanding the surrender of Antioch, but Bohemond refused. The emperor's envoys promised that Alexius would bring gifts by June 25th, but Raymond of St. Gilles, who had become more supportive of the emperor, wanted to wait. Bohemond, however, argued that the emperor had broken the agreement by not providing supplies or following up with an army. The majority agreed with Bohemond, and the march to Jerusalem resumed. The Crusaders also did not return Edessa to the Byzantines. Edessa became a Frankish county ruled by Baldwin of Boulogne, who had taken over from its ruler Toros. The First Crusade had a significant impact on the Armenians, who lived in the region between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Cilicia, a coastal area between the Taurus, Anti-Taurus, and Amanus mountains, had long been a refuge for Armenians fleeing from Greater Armenia, which was located around Mount Ararat. After the Byzantine Empire conquered Greater Armenia in 1045, and the Seljuk Turks invaded after Manzikert, more Armenians moved to Cilicia. Some Armenians served the Byzantines as governors and military officers, and established themselves as warlords when Byzantine power declined. One of the most successful warlords was Philaretus, who built a principality from Cilicia to Edessa between 1078 and 1085. After his death, several warlords took control of different cities. Oshan, a Byzantine Armenian governor, controlled the key fortresses of Lampron and Baburin. Constantine, a rival warlord, controlled Partsepert and Vacha, north of Sis, which later became the capital of Lesser Armenia. Other warlords like Tataul, Cog-Vassal, Gabriel, and Toros controlled cities like Maras, Rabin, Kesaun, Malatia, and Edessa. The Armenians welcomed the Crusaders, unlike the Byzantines, and the relationship between the two groups was generally positive. Both the Armenian and Frankish leaders belonged to a warrior aristocracy, which helped foster good relations. Baldwin of Boulogne, for example, took Cog-Vassal's brother, Bagrat, into his entourage during the siege of Iznik. Baldwin and Tancred, Bohemond's nephew, decided to separate from the main army and enter Cilicia through the Cilician gates. Tancred, with the help of Oshan, captured Tarsus, Adana, and Alexandretta, while Baldwin took Mamistra and then Edessa, where he succeeded Toros as the lord. The main Crusader army, following the advice of Taticius, took a longer route through Armenia. They passed through Augustopolis, Caesarea, and other cities, where they received help from local Armenians. The army was welcomed by Tataul and Maras, and Taticius confirmed him in his position. The army then continued to Antioch. The good relationship between the Armenians and the Franks was further strengthened by marriages. Baldwin of Boulogne married Arda, a granddaughter of Constantine. Baldwin of Laberg, who later became the Count of Edessa and the King of Jerusalem, married Morphia, the daughter of Gabriel of Malatia. Their daughter, Melisende, married Count Fulk of Anjou, who became the King of Jerusalem. Jocelyn of Courtenay, who became the Count of Edessa, also married a daughter of Constantine. The Franks and Armenians had a close relationship, both physically and culturally. This was evident when, on January 6, 1198, Leon II, the ruler of Cilicia, was crowned King of Lesser Armenia. The crown was sent by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, son of the Crusader Frederick Barbarossa. In the Crusader states, which were foreign and often hostile to the Islamic world, there was little cultural or technical exchange. However, the most clear example of exchange was in military developments. The story of the Crusader states, especially Antioch, is a tale of constant struggle and adaptability. From the moment the Crusaders established their foothold in Syria-Palestine, they faced relentless opposition from their Muslim neighbors and the Byzantine Empire. The Franks, as the Crusaders were known, relied heavily on their castles and fortifications to protect their territories. Sieges were more common than open battles, and both sides developed sophisticated siege engines to either defend or attack these strongholds. Over time, the Muslims became more adept at using heavy siege equipment, which marked a turning point in the balance of power. The fall of Montferrand to the Muslims was a significant blow to Frankish confidence, leading them to build concentric castles with multiple layers of walls for better defense. Despite the constant warfare, there were moments of cultural exchange, though these were limited. In Antioch, a city with a diverse population, there were instances of learning and translation. For example, the Pisans, a powerful maritime republic, were given a quarter in Antioch in exchange for their support during the Crusades. This allowed Arabic manuscripts to be transmitted to Pisa, where they were translated into Latin. One notable translation was the medical treatise Kitab al-Malaki by Ali al-Abbas al-Majusi, which became an important medical text in the West. The Franks also relied on Christian, Jewish, and Muslim physicians, reflecting the multicultural nature of the region. The family of Abu Sulayman Dawud, originally from Jerusalem, served King Amalric and later the Ayyubids, demonstrating the fluidity of allegiances in this period. However, the lack of a common language between the Franks and their neighbors often led to misunderstandings and mistrust. In the early years, the most significant threat to Antioch came from Ridwan, the ruler of Aleppo. In 1100, Bohemond, the first prince of Antioch, defeated Ridwan and expanded his territory. However, the Franks faced a major setback in 1104, when they were defeated by a combined force from Mosul and Hisn Kaifa. Bohemond was captured, and Antioch lost much of its northern territory. Bohemond's absence and eventual death in 1111 led to his nephew Tancred taking over the principality. Tancred's leadership brought some stability, and he successfully defended Antioch against Ridwan in 1105. However, the Seljuk Sultan began to take a more active interest in the region, sending military leaders to campaign against the Franks. One of these leaders, Madad, achieved some success, but was ultimately murdered in 1113. The Seljuk Sultan then appointed Aksungur al-Bursaki to govern Mosul and continue the fight against the Franks. Aksungur's efforts were met with mixed results, and he was eventually dismissed. The situation in Antioch became more complex as local politics took center stage. Tughtagin, the Atabeg of Damascus, and El-Ghazi, the Artukid lord of Mardin, played significant roles in the region. In 1118, El-Ghazi took control of Aleppo, and the following year he led a campaign against Antioch. The Battle of Ager Sanguini in 1119 was a devastating defeat for the Franks, resulting in the death of Roger of Salerno and the loss of key territories. This marked a significant shift in the balance of power, and King Baldwin II of Jerusalem had to step in to manage the affairs of Antioch. The relationship between Antioch and the Byzantine Empire was always tense. Bohemond had initially sworn fealty to Emperor Alexius Comnenus, but later reneged on this promise, claiming Antioch as his own. The Byzantines, who had a legitimate claim to Antioch, considered Bohemond a usurper. This led to a series of conflicts and uneasy truces, with the Byzantines often supporting Muslim rulers against the Franks. In the end, the Principality of Antioch, like the other Crusader states, was a complex mix of military might, cultural exchange, and political maneuvering. The Franks, despite their initial successes, faced mounting challenges from their neighbors and internal divisions. The story of Antioch is a testament to the resilience and adaptability of its rulers, but it also highlights the inevitable decline of the Crusader presence in the region.